This week on Brian Ross Investigates, cause of death. The forensic pathologist involved in cases from Elvis to Kurt Cobain to John Benet Ramsey weighs in tonight on the George Floyd case.
Well, I think it's going to be difficult to truly get a fair trial.
The prosecution says there's no doubt George Floyd died because of Officer Derek Chauvin's knee restraint technique seen in the phone video. But the official autopsy also found Floyd had a heart condition and a potentially lethal level of the drug fentanyl in his system.
In another new document, Baker says that is a fatal level of fentanyl under normal circumstances.
That's the way the game is played.
Well, Dr. Wecht, are you saying then that the medical examiner essentially was trying to cover up for Derek Chauvin and the Minneapolis Police Department?
Plus, what's behind the surge in children and teenagers at the southern border? Is the Biden administration up to the challenge?
I can say quite clearly, don't come, and what we're in the process of getting set up.
Please don't come doesn't mean anything here. This decision is weighed heavily, and a wish by the President of the United States isn't going to change that.
And this week's winners and losers in the media, taking off the gloves on the Biden White House.
Why were you not prepared for this?
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our viewers on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with cause of death. That will be the central issue in the trial next week of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. The official autopsy called the death of George Floyd a homicide, pointing to the knee-to-neck restraint technique used by Chauvin. But the autopsy also listed possible heart issues that Floyd had and what the autopsy called a potentially lethal level of the drug fentanyl. Rhonda?
That's right. But George Floyd's family commissioned a private autopsy done by the renowned pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, who presented his very definitive and different conclusion at a press conference last year.
The autopsy shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problem that caused or contributed to his death. The cause of death, in my opinion, is asphyxia due to compression of the neck, which, as Mr. Crump indicated, can interfere with blood flow and oxygen going to the brain, and compression of the back, which interferes with breathing.
And we're joined now by forensic pathologist, Dr. Cyril Wecht. Dr. Wecht, thank you for being here this evening. As you know, this case could well come down to the autopsy and the findings. Is it possible that he died of something other than the knee-to-neck restraint? Were there enough drugs in his system that could have killed him? Was the heart condition enough that could have killed him?
Thank you for affording me the opportunity to speak with you about this fascinating, highly important case. Pleasure to chat with you. My answer to your question, succinctly to begin with, is no. I do not believe that Mr. Floyd died from fentanyl toxicity or from hypertensive arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or a combination of those two. Yes, it is true that the fentanyl level in this case was high enough to kill somebody. But it is also true that people with that level and higher levels do not die. I don't know what his tolerance level was that he may have built up over the years. The point is that when he was stopped by the cops for that counterfeit money order, whatever it was, and so on, he was somewhat, you could say, aggressive. He was resisting arrest, you could say. You know, those are other things. But that is not the scenario that one would find of an individual who is going to succumb to fentanyl. He did not just succumb to fentanyl during the course of the struggle, where just a moment or so before he stopped breathing, before he stopped speaking, before he stopped making sounds, before he stopped making any movement, and then all of a sudden he died. That is not the way it would have happened in this case.
And Dr. Wecht, as you know, the official autopsy report does open the door a bit for the defense to argue, in fact, that's what killed him. It's not definitive, is it?
And no, it's not definitive. And, I don't want to say anything of a non hominem nature. And I don't know the medical examiner. I'm sure he's a competent forensic pathologist and so on. But, for a medical examiner to kind of smooth over a case involving a police-related death, that is about as unexpected and atypical as it would be for me to want a drink of water sometime later this afternoon. And that's surprising. That's the way 80-90% of my colleagues play the game. It's not a massive, malevolent conspiracy in which they get together with cops around the country and decide what they're going to do. That's the way the game is played.
Well, Dr. Wecht, are you saying then that the medical examiner essentially was trying to cover up for Derek Chauvin and the Minneapolis Police Department?
I would not use the word cover up.
Sounds pretty close.
I would use the phraseology kind of smooth over. That's what I would say.
Is that an abdication of his duty, you think, to be forthright?
I believe that it is an abdication of his duties of medical examiners around the country who go along and allow district attorneys alone to determine whether charges will be filed in police-related deaths. They have nothing to say. They speak forensic scientifically. They have no input. They don't conduct inquests. They don't follow through with public comments and so on. You have all of these police-related deaths, and especially when the African-American population is involved. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Sandra Bland in Texas, Eric Garner in New York, Arbery in Georgia, Tamir Rice in Cleveland. Look at those cases and see what was done criminally. And in every one of the cases, which I have referred to, there were settlements civilly, multi-millions of dollars. And of course, $27 million now settlement already in the Derek Chauvin, George Floyd case. What does that tell you? Are city councils and county governments and state governments rolling over and just opening up their wallets? If they feel they have a case to defend, then defend it. But no, they just don't do anything criminally. Cops walk away, but let the families proceed. And we, the taxpayers, will pay the money with no knowledge or input on our part. That's what I am saying.
Dr. Wecht, who served more than 2 decades as the coroner and medical examiner in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, has been involved or consulted in some of the most high-profile death cases in recent memory, including Elvis Presley, Kurt Cobain, John Benet Ramsey.
Dr. Wecht, how do you think this case of George Floyd compares? And can he get a fair trial? Can Derek Chauvin get a fair trial with all that publicity?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult to truly get a fair trial. I find it hard to imagine.
And what does the prosecution do? And they must know now the defense for Derek Chauvin is going to try to build its case around the presence of the fentanyl.
I hope that they will listen to your program and they will take my suggestion of going back and getting every fentanyl drug toxicity death signed out by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office. You don't have to go any further. It's a big size jurisdiction. Go back for a year or more, get every fentanyl case, look through the police investigative reports, comments from families and friends about the circumstances, the scenario that existed when that individual died. And there is your answer. There's your rebuttal to the defense presentation of this being a fentanyl drug death.
It's just not there from previous cases, you're saying.
That's right.
Dr. Cyril Wecht, thank you so much for being with us here this evening.
Thank you. Thanks.
Coming up next, the surge of teenagers, young children across the border from Mexico. What's behind all of this? We'll find out. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Turning now to the crisis the White House says is not a crisis, even as U.S. border agents are being overwhelmed by a surge of teenagers and children coming across the border from Mexico, with Rhonda, the numbers growing almost every day.
While there's often a spring surge, officials report in the month of February alone, they detained over 9,400 unaccompanied minors just this past month, Brian.
We're joined now by John Carlos Frey, documentary filmmaker and journalist who's been covering developments at the border for years. John, how do we explain this latest surge that's going on? What is going on?
It's complicated, Brian. I wish there was just one reason why kids are coming, but for the most part, the United States before Biden took office had kept people from getting into the country. The Trump administration was deporting everybody because of COVID. They didn't want anybody to cross the border, and that meant children, also children. By tradition, the United States does not deport children. We allow them in, we bring them in, we shelter them, and we try to look for their family members and reunite them. The Trump administration was not doing that. Every time a child tried to cross the border, the Trump administration would deport them. And they usually stayed in ports of entry like Tijuana and Juarez. So for the past year, kids were not getting in. There's been a backlog. Kids have been waiting, sometimes by themselves in strange cities. And as soon as Biden took office, that order to deport all children was rescinded. And we see this big influx. Also, there's a lot of issues and problems going on in Central America that are causing children to come to the border. So it's a very complicated issue. And lastly, I think that we have to realize this happens every year. Springtime, when the weather gets a little bit warmer before it gets too hot, that's when we usually see the big spike in migration. So we're seeing all of those factors added together.
John, are these children traveling on their own? Are they with parents?
The children, for the most part, if you can believe it or not, are traveling by themselves. We're talking about 13-year-olds who actually make this journey over 1,000 miles in some cases to the US-Mexico border. It is known in many of these sending countries, especially in Central America, that children are allowed into the United States, that children will be cared for. We also need to know that children grow up a lot faster in these countries. Kids are working at age 12, 13, 14 years old. They are almost adults. So if their parents can't make it, they're going to make that journey. A lot of them also are trying to reunite. Maybe their parents are already in the United States and they're trying to find a way to meet up with their parents and rejoin them. So yeah, I've seen them. I've seen trains filled with children, what we would call children, making this journey all by themselves.
I'm catching up with a caravan once they've already been on the road for a month, traveled almost 1,000 miles, and are arriving in Mexico City. I find a lot of people who worked on farms and say that they fled because of the drought.
Mira, hubo mucha sequía. Hubo mucha sequía, las milpas, la mazorquita es pequeña.
Ya no va a salir, mira.
So todo está perdido.
Está perdido. Todo eso está perdido.
This year, in just one dry corridor country, Honduras, 80% of the corn and bean crops were lost.
You've reported again and again about the impact of climate change and the devastating impact it's had on Central American countries. That's still the case, I think.
I think that's what we're really seeing here. It hasn't really been explored in depth. If we take a look at why people are coming from Central America, especially, there is now, we're beginning the 6th year of the drought. There are 450,000 people in Central American countries that are at starvation level.
Pero igual cuando ya sientes el hambre, que el hambre ya te trae encima, que tal vez tus hijos te están exigiendo, papá, quiero comer de tal cosa, quiero comer comida buena, quiero comer carne. Entonces, es ahí donde te llenas de coraje y dices, me voy.
These are people who cannot live off the land. It's primarily an agricultural region. And if you can withstand 5 or 6 years of drought, that's what's happening. These people have tried everything. There are no jobs. COVID has hit everybody really hard there. There's a high level of unemployment. There's high crime. Where do you go? What do you do? If you can't find a job, you can't feed your family, you can't raise crops. And these are usually the conditions that we see there, and they seem to be getting worse. Climate change seems to be the cause of the drought right now. Not only that, it's not just drought, but we're talking about weather extremes. Just this past year, Honduras experienced one of the largest hurricanes that they have in their entire history. It wiped out villages and towns, farmland, so people aren't able to work like they used to.
So when President Biden says in his interview with ABC, please don't come,
I can say quite clearly, don't come. And what we're in the process of getting set up, and it's not going to take a whole long time, is to be able to apply for asylum in place. So don't leave your town or city or community.
Does that have any impact at all?
Please don't come. The conditions that I just described to you don't really remedy anything. Please don't come is a nothing compared to these people. If you can imagine what it would take to allow your 13-year-old to make this dangerous journey, it's not a light decision. Please don't come doesn't mean anything here. This decision is weighed heavily. They've tried absolutely everything else. By the time a 13-year-old gets on a train or a bus to head to the United States, everything else has been tried. There are no other options. This is a very last resort maneuver. I always think of a child getting to the US-Mexico border as the canary in the coal mine. We don't usually see children migrating. That is a very last resort. We rarely see women migrating. It's usually able-bodied men who come to work in the United States and send money back home. If children are showing up, it's a very serious problem. And a wish by the President of the United States isn't going to change that.
All right, John Carlos Frey, documentary filmmaker and journalist, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thanks, Brian. It's a pleasure.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media as chosen by Mediaite, ABC's Martha Raddatz, asking the tough questions of the Biden White House. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, we begin with the first winner of the day, Martha Raddatz, my old friend and colleague from ABC News, taking on the Biden White House, always ready to ask the tough questions, as she did last Sunday on the program This Week.
Come.
I know you're trying to get that message out now, but your team was also briefed by career professionals at DHS during the transition about the possibility of this crisis. You yourself say we are on pace to have one of the largest migrant surges in 20 years. Why were you not prepared for this?
Martha Raddatz, don't tangle with her, right, Aidan?
Right. So that was Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas. And he made the rounds on the Sunday shows this weekend in light of the surge of migrants at the southern border, which has raised questions about the Biden administration's handling of the immigrants that are coming to the border from Central America. Mayorkas made the rounds on the Sunday shows this weekend. He was on CNN, he was on Face the Nation, he was on Meet the Press, he was on Fox News Sunday, getting interviewed by Chris Wallace, who's always a great interrogator. But in our opinion, Martha Raddatz had the best interview with Mayorkas. She pressed him on the treatment of undocumented migrants and minors at the border. She pressed him on media access to border and customs patrol facilities down there. And she also, as you saw in that video, questioned him on why the Biden administration wasn't prepared for this surge at the border, given that they knew that something like this would happen. And Mayorkas' response is basically that the Biden administration, that it's going to take time for the Biden administration to be able to respond to this after the Trump administration basically dismantled the process for processing migrants coming across the border. It was one of the best interviews we saw among many that Mayorkas did this weekend. So we named Martha Raddatz winner for that reason.
And no surprise that she would do just that. And for the loser, a big interview with former President Trump from Fox News with a major gaffe. Watch this.
You know, I want to get to this because it's just happened now, and I want to double check this with our producers. The DHS Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, has resigned, Mr. President.
Well, I'm not surprised. Good. That's a big victory for our country.
Hold on. Let me stop. Let me stop. Let me listen to my team one more time. Forgive me. Forgive me. That has not happened.
How could that happen, Aidan?
I mean, an absolutely brutal mistake from Harris Faulkner, the Fox anchor. You know, you can kind of tell what happened here. My best bet, and Fox News has just blamed this on an error, the result of the programming being remote right now and everyone working from home. What I assume happened is, President Trump has been criticizing Alejandro Mayorkas quite harshly. He sent out a statement last night criticizing him for his appearances on the Sunday shows and defending the Biden administration immigration policies. And what I assume happened is a producer said something to Harris Faulkner along the lines of, "Are you calling for Alejandro Mayorkas to resign?" She thought that he was saying that Alejandro Mayorkas had resigned. She obviously broke in with that news. That would have been a huge story, and she had the former president on the phone to react to it. I can only imagine what a producer was saying in her ear after she had falsely announced that the Department of Homeland Security secretary had just resigned. She did a cleanup job. She apologized for it, and Fox News issued a statement saying, "We're sorry that this happened." Still a major, major flub for an anchor to make during a live interview with the former president.
And all of us who rely on the little pieces of audio coming through our ears, that can happen, and your heart goes out to Ms. Faulkner. But at Fox News, they should really do a better job than that.
I mean, one just has to think that when you hear something like that, a producer say something like that, you should confirm it before announcing it and reporting it on air. Particularly given it doesn't sound like I can't imagine the producer was particularly, confident in the claim that Mayorkas had just resigned. So the fact that Faulkner did not, take a step back, say, let me double check this, get the statement up, get some further evidence to support the claim that the DHS secretary had just resigned. I mean, that's a big flub. And of course, it's very terrible. She's live. She's interviewing the former president. It's hard to put yourself in her shoes, but it's a pretty serious mistake. And I guess it's to her credit. They
Absolutely.
cleaned it up right then and there, seconds later.
All right. All right. Thanks, Aidan. Thanks to all of you for watching, and have a good evening.